to Raconteurs News.
You're listening to Andy Young and Jason Holmes on RaconteursNews.com. Stay tuned for more untwisted, unsweetened news. And definitely no bingo.
Good evening and welcome to Raconteurs News. It's Thursday, the 21st of April, and I can hear a radio player in the background. Have you got the radio playing, Jason?
I have.
Yeah.
Just a second. It's
No
because I'm
worries,
in the
mate.
chat room and it's just automatically started. There we go, it's gone.
It does, mate. Yeah, no worries. Yeah, welcome to Raconteurs News, our new start time of 7 p.m. on a Thursday. We've had to move forward a bit early because we've got the one and only Dr. Rock coming on at 9 o'clock. Kicked off his presence on RN last week with an absolutely blinding show, and we're all looking forward to that tonight. But Jason, we've got one of our most popular guests on tonight. We've got Paul, our high-level financial insider. Good evening,
We
Paul.
do.
Good evening, gents. How are you both?
Well, I'm very well, thank you very much, Paul. I'm assuming Andy's very well as well. He seems to have, be up and about and getting out and doing things.
Yeah, well, I had a day out in the sunshine yesterday, which is always a tonic, isn't it?
Absolutely always a tonic, unless you're one of these celebrities that keeps trying to die on everybody.
Yes, so it seems absolutely ages since we spoke. I know it isn't, Paul, but...
Yeah, it's about just over 4 weeks ago. So
Wow.
time
Yeah.
flies.
A lot's happened since then, hasn't it?
It has indeed, but I thought I'd start off first because obviously back in December we said that there's kind of the hammers could start to fall. You'd see this acceleration of events, and there was a kind of belief that, excuse me, that we would see culmination in early 2016. Well, we've certainly seen the acceleration of events. I don't think anyone can doubt that, but we're kind of arguably getting towards the end of early 2016, and it doesn't look like the world's going to see the Berlin Wall moment that I refer to it. So I think it's kind of worth pointing out at this time that, okay, we're going to have to revise those timescales. Now, what's kind of an interesting backstop to this is, obviously, I have sources of information, people I deal with, but my main source of information has been off radar now for 9 weeks, and we've not heard a word from them. They're perfectly okay, there's no problem. I'm in touch with a relation of theirs who says they're perfectly okay, but we don't know what they're doing, what's going on. I suspect they're in the middle of doing a great many things towards us achieving that Berlin Wall moment, kind of anticipating, are they going to reappear just before it happens? We don't know. But the fact they've gone off radar for 9 weeks, when normally the longest they've ever been off radar is a day or two, I think speaks volumes. So we wait with anticipation when they come back and to find out from their perspective what's going on. Yes, there's always the statement that something can happen today, tomorrow, next week, next month, and that certainly does apply. But I think it's worth at this point saying, well, okay, it doesn't appear as though it will happen early 2016. Doesn't mean things aren't happening. We know clearly that is the case, and we don't really know. But having had no update from this person for 9 weeks makes it rather difficult to know what's going on, seeing as they generally pretty much have a good idea, more or less. Not all the details. Some of the stuff we discuss, we talk to him about it, and he becomes aware of things, because obviously you can't possibly know everything. But in broad terms, he does understand what's going on. But without that input, it's made it rather difficult to be able to comment. Is that exactly what's happening? And people use the word delay. I don't tend to use the word delay because this isn't a time-driven scenario; it's an event-driven scenario. But I thought, given it's the 21st of April, we ought to make some comment about that.
Yeah, it is. It is. We are sort of getting towards the middle of the month now, aren't we? Sort of in the third. The middle third of the year. So it's. But there has been moves with gold and silver involving China, if I read correctly.
Yeah, well, I think it's a good point to talk about gold and silver, because the last week or two we've seen some quite incredible, finally, some incredible admissions, because for years, I mean, we spoke about this when we first came on the radio about gold and silver market rigging, and we've always said adamantly it was the case. There was never any admission of it. And then on the 14th of April, Deutsche Bank came out and admitted that it had been involved in gold, and then it said, and silver price manipulation for years. There was a kind of puzzlement as to why they admitted it, but they then said that they were involved in this conspiracy together with other members of a cartel, and apparently they've agreed to name the names in the US federal court. So that will be a huge indictment, because not only are they admitting it themselves, but they intend to turn on all their other cohorts involved in this particular aspect of market manipulation. And it's interesting that on the back of this exposure, it's already had a kind of domino effect, because within a couple of days there's been 2 class action lawsuits, including apparently, I believe, the Bank of Nova Scotia, and these were launched in the Ontario Superior Court of Justice on behalf of, oddly enough, Canadian gold and silver investors. And there's a belief that that could possibly be just the tip of the iceberg, because arguably, how many other people are going to step up and say, well, look how much money I've lost trading gold and silver over the last kind of 15 years or so. So it could be a straw that breaks the camel's back. Now, how many of the other banks that are allegedly involved in this will also be found guilty or later and admit to it remains to be seen. But there is some speculation that it's not a coincidence that developments in China have led to this admission, because, as you rightly just said, Jason, on the 19th of April, finally, we saw the much vaunted Chinese yuan-denominated gold fix. And I think there's something I need to mention here, because there are countless people getting in touch with me and putting reference to the fact, oh no, China's got this new gold-backed currency. No, it is not a Chinese gold-backed currency. It is merely that they're going to price gold in yuan. Now, that actually did come in on the 19th, as was expected. We talked about that previously. There's 12 banks participating in that, 10, oddly enough, are Chinese, and there's Standard Chartered Bank and also the Australian New Zealand Bank who are taking part. That obviously went operational, as we said, on the 19th. Now, the difference, obviously, with the Shanghai Gold Exchange is for every ounce of gold that is acquired, it is backed by real physical metal, as opposed to arguably questions, particularly about the COMEX, where there is no backing. And there is questions, obviously, about the LBMA in London. Now, obviously, now that's gone live, there was immediately this anticipation we're going to see this huge price resetting gold. And we talked about the fact that, you know, the yuan gold fix would ultimately see a reset in the gold price. But it's not going to happen overnight, and there's a number of reasons for that. If China was to say immediately, well, we're going to reset gold to $2,000 an ounce, it all sounds great in principle until you would see this avalanche immediately of people selling and dumping physical metal because they've immediately made 70-80%. It's likely to end up causing huge problems where you get this big spike in the price and then the market would crash. Bullion dealers would be left holding who knows how much gold, probably at a significant loss. The price would just collapse. It would cause utter chaos. And there's no point China saying, well, you know, we intended, you know, we want to control the world's gold market. We want to play a much more important role. We see it as an important aspect of the new financial system. But by the way, you know, we've just decided to do this and we've crashed the entire gold and ultimately probably silver as well market. So it's hardly a good way to endear yourself to people, and for them, and your credibility would just be in the pan, as they say. So we've seen, of course, a couple of days where the price, particularly in silver, rose quite sharply. But of course, interestingly today, which is sort of early afternoon UK time, the price got hammered, or they attempted to hammer it, by dumping the equivalent of 50 tons of gold contracts. That's like effectively saying we've sold 50 tons of gold in the market. It did only actually jolt the price about 2% and it started to recover. But it was a clear attempt at trying to manipulate the market. And this just proves the insanity of it, because did any of these people actually have 50 ton of gold to sell? No, obviously not. and it will take a little bit of time to kind of find an equilibrium. And I've talked about price discovery, and we've not had price discovery in the gold and silver markets for years, whereby price discovery means that the true equilibrium between the supply or demand and the supply is met. You'll get that when you have a proper gold-backed gold exchange, which is what Shanghai is about, as opposed to the paper farce we've discussed previously, which is predominant in the West. So we are in the early days. I expect we'll have some volatility and some fluctuation, but at some point we will start to see proper price discovery. And increasingly, of course, and on the back of that, we also saw, interestingly, where the Chinese took a market maker role in the LBMA in London. I think there's no significance to that all come in just before this gold fix, and obviously before Deutsche making their remarks about their admission of rigging the gold and silver market. And the Chinese bank in London's the ICBC Standard Bank. It's actually China and the world's largest bank, and that's reclassified as a spot market making member of the LBMA. That came in early April. I think it's an important development and shows China's intent with regards to becoming a key player in the gold global market. Interestingly, it came out on the LBMA site at 9 p.m. on the 4th of April, almost as though, somewhat apologetically, they didn't want too many people to notice that was happening. But of course, it very much has happened. And that's kind of where we are in that respect of what's happened lately in gold. I think people shouldn't underestimate Deutsche's admission. That is a huge admission. For years, people like myself have been trying to get acknowledgement that this was going on, and we were largely laughed at for a long time. And people said, it's just conspiracy nonsense. Well, it's now conspiracy fact, and it should help to readdress some of the concerns, because the ramifications aren't just going to stop with Deutsche. Deutsche is going to whistle on all the other members of the cartel involved. It will have ramifications. And in the meantime, we're seeing China take more of a stranglehold in terms of how the market should really operate in a true kind of price discovery, demand supply scenario. But I think we shouldn't forget silver either, because we've seen some quite astonishing developments in respect of that. And I kind of decided to look recently what was going on with the Shanghai Silver Exchange. Now, what I actually discovered was that, obviously, it's known that JP Morgan has a huge amount of silver inventory. But what has actually come to pass was that in, obviously, the Shanghai Silver Exchange, they increased in a period of around 6 months from around it was about 7.5 million ounces. It's now 54.7 million ounces in less than, well, it's actually just under 6 months. And to put that in context, it took JP Morgan to achieve the same objective around, I think it was about 4 years to accumulate that much silver. And interestingly, JP Morgan is believed is actually accumulating silver for the Chinese, because it seems counterintuitive to the fact they hold massive short position themselves, which they inherited from the ABN AMRO days back in 2008, 2009. So, and we increasingly, of course, see key players around the world still buying up gold and silver. So, and also in the West. So, eventually, at some point, this paper market will die. It will disappear. And we're already actually, interestingly, seeing within the West where the LBMA is sitting down and it's kind of frankly admitting there's problems with their exchange and there's a need to regulate it and reform it. I suspect strongly that probably has as much to do, not just internally, but also because of the Chinese influence now as a market maker, as we said just earlier a few minutes ago, and their involvement in the LBMA.
So just what happens if there's a gold reset in price? What happens to the paper market? And do you think that the paper market is the one that's holding back from this this happening? So quicker than what it appears to be.
No, well, for sure, the paper market has been a problem for, as we said, in terms of manipulating the price. I think the stranglehold that the paper market has is diminishing rapidly now. It's not entirely disappeared. We saw an example today where they dumped the equivalent of 50 tons worth of contracts into the market to smash the price, and it had a very muted effect, nowhere near what they would have anticipated. I mean, silver nearly hit, about 17.75 today. That's up around 30% this year. Gold, I think, is up 15-20% this year, and it's around about 12.50 now. It got to 12.70 now. We know that Goldman's holds a massive short position that will get taken out at 12.90. I wouldn't be surprised if there is some resistance to that, but I think the resistance is getting weaker. And of course, for sure, at some point when price discovery happens, and if the reset happens, if gold goes to $1,800, whenever that may happen, it will destroy the paper market. The derivatives market will collapse. They have such huge short positions, particularly in silver, even more so than gold. It will destroy the paper market. And that's the whole point of this, that China does things very, very efficiently and quietly. The gold price fix is just one aspect of this whole reset in terms of having the gold standard back and gold-backed currencies. It's just one small aspect of it. It's not the entire picture, and it's not realistic to expect the price to be reset overnight. You need to bed a new system, and it's all well and good saying, well, hang on, we've got this new gold price fix that we're operating. We're going to go live. You need to let it bed in and integrate first and let it find some kind of equilibrium within itself. But obviously, as China, within this process, acquires more and more gold, at some point in the future, I think the next big announcement will be China's going to stand up and say, we're the biggest gold holder in the world. I think that is a major announcement that's going to rock the whole gold market, because all of a sudden people are going to say, well, if you're the biggest gold holder, what's happened to all the gold which we know doesn't exist in the US? Because the reality is China's downplayed the true amount of their massive gold holding. I believe it's at least 30,000 tons and probably considerably more than that. And I think we're nearing the point where the Chinese will announce we are the largest holders of gold in the world. Russia may argue actually they are, but it doesn't really matter. The fact if both of them say it, even better. But whatever happens, that will put China at the forefront in controlling the global monetary system. Because the idea is, well, if we're going to have a gold-backed currency in the future, well, if we hold the most amount of gold, then it puts us in a very strong position. And people will say, well, they're taking the dominant position. No, they're not. They're leading by example and saying, look, this is the future. We're not having a fiat fiasco anymore, paper-backed, nonsensical gold and silver markets to hold the dollar up. We're having a new financial system. So this gold price fixing is a very important and significant part of that. Deutsche's admission's another very significant part of that. And we're in the first few days. This is the third day, going into the fourth day in China of this new gold price fix coming out of Shanghai. But we need to watch really closely and not get too bogged down in day-to-day what happens, but just to generally see, okay, there are going to be times when the paper system will try and fight back. They're not just going to give up. That doesn't mean they're doing it from a position of strength. It's a position of weakness, because every day they can smash the price and China goes, well, we'll just hoover up even more gold and silver. But the reason they're smashing the price, as well as trying to protect their derivative position, is to try and protect the phony dollar, which is also dying rapidly, as we know.
Yeah, I was just about to mention that the petrodollar, the more and more it seems to be, the power seems to be slipping away from the petrodollar. I noticed, I can't actually remember who it was, but hang on, I've got some great kids out. But I can't remember who it was, but it was another country that decided that they weren't going to be using petrodollar anymore. They're going to be using euros.
Well, that was it. Well, Iran's obviously been saying that they're not taking dollars for oil anymore. But I think it's actually quite good at this point too, because obviously we do get new listeners all the time, and maybe sometimes we can have a quick recap. If you think about it, the dollar was essentially established as the reserve currency in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Agreement. And in that position, the US leveraged itself into this power position by holding, at that time, what was seen to be the largest reserve of gold in the world, and the dollar was pegged at around $35 an ounce, and you could freely exchange it into gold. But of course, by the 60s, the wheels started to come off because there was this surplus of US dollars caused by foreign aid, military spending, and foreign investment. Because the US at that point didn't have enough gold to cover the volume of dollars in circulation, the dollar became overvalued. And, of course, in 71, the US was taken off the gold standard, and for 2 years it was just a pure fiat currency until the petrodollar agreement came into fruition via Kissinger, but Nixon in 73. And the base of the petrodollar was that Saudi would denominate all their oil trades in US dollars, and in return the US would sell Saudi all the military hardware and guarantee the defence of the kingdom. Well, kind of fast forward to 2008, and obviously the US now has this policy of zero interest rates and QE, which we know is hugely destructive. And one of the policies that the US has adopted as well is this: they had to rely on economic sanctions to force geopolitical capitulation of nations. You know, we've seen them trying it with Russia and they failed, but they succeeded in other nations. But of course, at some point, the targets of these would eventually decide, we're not going to put up with this anymore. We're sick of this US hegemony. And of course, consequently, what happened is nations began to fight back. And I think the irony is that for a whole period of time, even China and Russia, even though they opposed this US foreign policy, they were actually financing the US war machine, because they were purchasing US treasuries in this futile way, well, not futile, but in a way of protecting their own economies. But of course, we've now seen that Russia and China and other nations decided enough was enough, and they became big buyers of physical gold. And Russia's gold reserves, I think, would back even at, well, official levels. So probably unofficially it's 100%, but they would cut back around 30% of the ruble money supply. Well, that's far greater than the US's ability to cover gold, even though we know they don't actually have any. And then, of course, in 2014, we saw the big kind of Russian-China gas deal that was signed. That would be payment in yuan and Russian rubles, not in dollars. And that started this whole acceleration process of de-dollarization. And we just see it every day, of every week, of every month. Nations now no longer trading in dollars anymore. And of course, the Russian-China alternative to dollar we will see is the gold-backed ruble and the gold-backed yuan, which is why they've had massively increasing their gold reserves, and that will start ultimately the total death of the US dollar. And of course, when the US dollar dies as a reserve currency, the US's ability to finance wars with other people's money is gone. And we're already starting to see that, where because nations are dumping dollars and are no longer buying up US debt, the US's ability to wage war and to continue with this hegemony, which they've done for decades, is diminishing. And this is an important part of this, why de-dollarization is so important. And it isn't a process that happens overnight, but we've seen a huge acceleration in less than 2 years. I would have arguably been surprised even back then if we would have been here where we are in a decade, but we've gone so fast. And I know it doesn't seem to people that things are happening quickly because they don't see, I get a lot of people saying, well, I still see chemtrails in the sky and I still see GMO foods. Well, to remove those, you have to kill the financial system and starve the cabal financially to death, literally, and that de-dollarization is a huge part of that. So the things people expect to see are the very last things you will see. But by starving them into submission, and we're seeing that, it's now weakening their ability. And if they don't have the finance, they can't finance chemtrail programs. They can't finance the expansion of GMO. They can't finance their ability of wars, which is why they're now playing a relatively passive role in the Middle East, not as well as the fact that Russia has militarily is light years ahead of the West or the cabal. But these are important parts. So whilst it's frustrating and everyone's frustrated, and no one more than me. Even I've got to the point now where I'm rather fed up with it all, and I'd want an end to it. But I have to be realistic and say the end of it isn't going to be seeing chemtrails disappear now, and in 6 months we're still fighting the economic Third World War, which is what this is all about. And I think that little sort of history is to try and encapsulate what's gone on for a long time and how, over a relatively short period, we've seen particularly Russia and China, but other nations fighting back and saying enough's enough. And we can include Brazil in those nations that vehemently oppose this US foreign policy, and we're seeing what's happening there, where the cabal's desperately trying to impeach the leadership to remove them so they can try and put a more Western sympathetic regime in. But they're struggling hard to do it, and they may think they're going to succeed, but they won't. They'll ultimately fail as well.
Thank you, Paul. We're getting the questions stacking up for you as usual.
Okay.
If I could just start with a simple one from Tony Hurst. Tony's asking, can Paul please tell us anything about the bail-in in Austria and possible consequences?
Well, like all things with bail-ins, the issue's going to be and I've always said this, if you attempt to bail-ins in nations, what are you going to do? Basically empty everyone's bank account and say, they put their card in the wall and go, oh, I've got no money.
Yeah.
I don't ultimately see there's any way. If they really attempt that in any meaningful way, it will just wake up the masses within 10 seconds. Because the one thing you do is if you empty everyone's bank account, will start to say, well, actually, through negative interest rates, we're going to start taking X percent of your money, and starts disappearing. People are going to get very angry very quickly. So I don't see bail-ins. I think their ability to bail out, without dodging the question, is pretty much over. They can no longer do it. Yeah, they're trying covertly to do bailouts, and undoubtedly they probably are. But this public way of 2008 bailing out banks over bail-ins, negative interest rates for sure are going to be an issue. But the irony, of course, is in doing bail-ins or trying to have negative interest rate, banks need liquidity. Well, if you're going to cause a big bank rush and everyone panics and goes, God, they're starting to steal my money, what's the first thing everyone's going to do? They're going to run to their banks, draw as much money out as they can, as fast as they can. Well, that'll cause a bank run and collapse the banks. So they can't do a bail-in in that respect to any appreciable extent, because they'll collapse the banks that they're trying to preserve, because they will. We saw in the UK, remember with Northern Rock, where people went into blind panic and were rushing into banks, trying to draw all their money out. Well, that wasn't because of a bank bailing, that was a concern of a bank collapsing. Well, people suddenly start getting wind that, hang on, they're taking money out, I'm losing money out of my bank. People will panic and draw out, and it won't take long before you will have bank runs, and bank liquidity will dry up, and there's already enough bank liquidity issue, which the major banks are fighting on a daily basis. That would just cause their implosion. So it sounds like it's something that's feasible, but in reality, I just don't see how it can succeed. And you may see examples that talk about it, but
we have seen reports that there was a bank bail-in in Austria.
Oh, like I said, I'm not suggesting that it can't happen.
Yeah.
But I mean, in terms of the bank bail-in in Austria, I don't know the exact details of what happened. I thought actually there was warnings actually from the Austrian central bank about doing the very thing. So I'm not entirely sure. If someone's got more detail, I'd be intrigued to know, because I wasn't actually aware of any specific detail about Austria doing that. But I can look into it for sure.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Paul. We've got a question here from one of your followers in the USA, Daniel Knuchik. Apologies if I pronounce your name wrong, Daniel. But he asks, here in the USA, they're talking about new faces going on US currency. Is this a cover for the GCR, I presume that's global currency reset, that is about to happen? so that they can keep people's minds on other things than on the real issues?
Well, if indeed they do change, I mean, it's possible. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about, obviously, the US will lose its reserve currency status, and there's no doubt that's going to happen. Mm-hmm. And the US will get a treasury note of some description. There's big arguments about that, but let's not get bogged down in too much detail in respect of that. Is it a distraction? Well, it could be, but the ultimate question is, will the US lose its reserve currency status and the dollar as a Federal Reserve note? Well, yes, ultimately, of course, it will. And will it, have a treasury dollar? Yes. Will it be devalued? Probably. Or are they going to lease gold from the Chinese? Well, there was talk they were going to. It was a bit tentative. Now there's talk they won't. I think there's too much made. I keep seeing every week about these global currency reset and this RV. Oh, it's this date. No, next week it's this date. No, the following week it's this date. Yeah. I've been seeing this for months and months, and it never happened. Well, there's a reason for that, probably because actually the reality is whatever's being said is not going to happen. This currency reset is really about a gold standard. And those nations that have gold will have strong currency. Those nations, or other assets, maybe, like we said before, Mexico can have the peso, backed by silver. Other nations may use some assets, but those nations without either have to lease gold, and there's going to be some financial regulation around those nations and how. And the US will fall. Well, they'll have to probably toe the line, according to the Chinese, to some extent, if they do lease the gold from them. And if they don't, they're just going to have a third world economy and a currency that is essentially going to be massively devalued. So whether they're going to change the names, yeah, it makes interesting. I mean, does it mean anything? Well, not really, and I wouldn't take any notice of it. I think more importantly is what's going to happen to the dollar in the future.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thanks, Paul. We've got another one from Pankaj Patel. I noticed that's quite a lot of questions on your group there. And this one, question for Paul. The elite millionaires are fleeing the major cities like Chicago, Paris, and worldwide. What do they know that we don't in terms of what is coming?
Well, that's a good question, because there was talk 2 years ago they were all piling out of New York and moving upstate. We hear these stories, an awful lot of this happening, and it's been going on for a long time, and nothing subsequently happened. Is it a reality? I don't know. I don't really know whether it's true or not. There's an argument that might say, well, people are starting to become fearful of living in big cities because there is an anticipation the financial system is going to implode in some way, and maybe people are starting to get wind of this and are fearful because living in big cities would be a big problem. As we know, you're better living in more rural locations. So there is a possibility, but is there any actual evidence to support this? I don't know. And therefore, I think it's probably just speculation, and it makes great headlines, this idea. But it's been talked about for a long time, and I've never seen any evidence of that actually being the case.
Oh, we seem to have got a rather strange noise coming over Skype there. Can you hear that as well, Paul?
Yes, I think I heard myself in my... Well, it's stopped now, but...
Oh, that's strange. Yeah. I'm getting a message from Tony saying we're having problems with the website. So if anyone's having difficulty with the website, we are working on it, and we'll be back as soon as possible. It's currently showing for me all right at the minute, but we'll keep ploughing on because we know the recording's still working okay. Yeah, I just typed a message in the chat room. It's not coming through, so does seem to be a problem. Yeah. Yes, we do seem to be having problems. So anyone who's having any difficulty listening to us, if you go over to www.spreaker.com/user/Raconteurs News, you will find the live broadcast there as well. Okay, sorry about that. One more question before we move on, if I may, Paul. Patrick's asking, Question: is Paul of the opinion usury is a major problem and it must stop?
Yes, of course. I mean, absolutely, it's a major problem, and it has been, forever for the inception of this cabal-based financial system. Undoubtedly, I mean, there is always this question, though: is how do we kind of manage the financial system in a more equitable way going forward? I mean, I've said this before. The problem isn't the financial system; it's how it's administered, and certainly, without doubt, that is a huge aspect that needs to be looked into, and how it's going to be managed in the future. But for sure, yeah, it's certainly been a huge contributory factor to many of the problems we're seeing today. And actually, just while we were having that little problem technically,
Mm-hmm.
I've just noticed where this comment about this bail-in happened, and the source of information that I'm seeing is coming from has been making a number of comments about gold-backed, the gold-backed yuan coming in, all sorts of other things, and of course that's not happened. So I'm not saying that source is the only source that is stating this about Austria having a bail-in, but I'm not seeing anything. And if someone can correct me on that, I'll be very pleased if you would do so. But I'm not seeing anywhere that says there's a bail-in. I know there's problems with Austrian banks, but I'm not actually seeing that. But if anyone can find it, then message the chat room or let us know, because I'd like to know more detail about that.
Yeah.
Usually it would be all over the mainstream news. I've not seen anything. I know there's been a lot going on. We've had a benefit Scrouger's birthday today, and so they've been they've been concentrating mostly on that, and all the people that have turned up to say happy birthday to her. But usually something like that would be on the mainstream news if there was a bail-in in Austria, and I think there would be ramifications as well. I mean, with Europe.
I do remember back in earlier this. Well, no, actually, it was last year. It's over 12 months ago. Think about, there was an Austrian bank whose name slips my mind. I think it might be Hypo. Forgive my pronunciation. Hypo Alpi Adria. That apparently had this capital hole of something like 7.5 billion euros. There was talk about there would need to be a bank bail-in because they discovered this capital hole. There was a comment about that, but that was well over a year ago, and I don't think actually ultimately the problem was resolved by a bank bail-in.
Yeah, and like you said, if there was wind of a bail-in anyway, people will be taking their money out of their accounts. I remember, well, I don't remember because it was just before I met her, but my wife was a manager at Northern Rock, and when they were queuing outside, I remember she had a particular hatred of Robert Peston, who was in the queue. So yeah, I remember that well. The bail-ins, that would cause a bit of a panic and a run on the banks, wouldn't it?
Oh yeah, I mean, no disrespect to Austria, but economically it's quite small, and I wouldn't call. I'm not suggesting 7.5 billion euros is small change, but in banking terms it is, and that was going back over a year ago. So, and I've not heard anything subsequently about that. So I tend to think we have to be a little bit careful.
Perhaps Austria's taking the money out, bailing the money out, and sending it to Panama. What did you make of those shenanigans?
Well, there's a great story. I mean, the immediate assumption was, and of course, as with all these situations, we look at it, and the immediate question was, there's been this leak. I mean, and I'm pretty sure most people probably know the story, but maybe we could just say what actually happened was the German newspaper, I think it's Süddeutsche Zeitung, forgive my German, they received this leak giving this explanation about all these offshore financial vehicles existing with all sorts of people exploiting tax loopholes, etc., etc. And what it effectively, interestingly, it came out exposing the usual suspects, Russia, and saying about China is trying to finger Putin via some convoluted route that it was somebody he once knew and a friend of his from way back when. And then they tried to mention Syria, and I think Zimbabwe was mentioned, North Korea, and of course the immediate reaction is, oh, it's a cabal leak. The cabal have done this. They're just trying to discredit Putin and try to discredit Assad and try to discredit China for all the obvious reasons. Now, interestingly, the Guardian newspaper reported this, but there was obviously a kind of filtering of information by the corporate media, and people saying, "Oh, well, there's this, Western government agenda behind this," because obviously there had to be Western corporations and Western billionaires and trillionaires, whoever involved, and there was no mention of any Americans. I know, obviously, we had the mention of Cameron's father and that kind of association, but it appeared as though much of this leaked material remains private, and we're not going to discuss it. And of course, we saw back in the Snowden files where MI6 instructed the Guardian to destroy all the information. So people immediately jumped to the conclusion, oh, well, it's Soros financed, or it's the cabal, and they're trying to discredit Putin. Now, I kind of went away and thought about this and went, well, okay, yeah, it's a possibility. But why would US intelligence, why would Soros and all these people leak this information to discredit Putin? Because let's face it, they've thrown the kitchen sink at discrediting Putin and discrediting Assad and discrediting China. And it just backfired on them completely, because anyone in the West who thinks Putin's bad is not really going to go, oh, well, he's got all this money, or his friends have, or some associate has. Nobody really cares about that. No one, and if that was their sole intention to do that, then it seemed a pretty futile attempt to convince people in the West of that Putin's the bad guy. They could easily do far more than that. They could have just invented some nonsense about it, arming the Ukrainian rebels to try and start a war again. They could have said anything about what was going on in Syria. They could have accused them of all manner of things. But they went about it that way. So I kind of thought, hang on, who actually would profit the most from these leaks in a roundabout way? And I actually wouldn't be surprised, and I've said this before, that in fact it's Russia and Putin who are responsible for this. Because from what I see from this, there's no real damage being done to him, but there is collateral damage to the US allies. And if the Russians did it, they can expose corrupt politicians everywhere, including all these apparent Western democracies, and it could foment genuine, destabilization in certain Western countries very easily. They can also make the Western press look kind of ridiculous in its obsession with Putin, and the absence of any notable Americans in it obviously would make it look like a kind of Langley Soros operation. Now, of course, we know that Russia has incredible hacking capability. They've got actually cyber units based in the Kremlin. They could have obtained the documents because, after all, Mossack Fonseca were adamant that the leak was not an inside job. So is it possible that the operation could have been run out of an agency that Russia has called the RFM, that's apparently supposed to be Putin's personal financial intelligence unit? Apparently he created it and it's only answerable to him. I mean, okay, it's completely legitimate, but it's widely recognised as probably the most powerful such agency in the world, where it has a monopoly on information about money laundering, offshore centres, and issues, relating to Russian and Russian nationals. So they would have the capability. They stand to gain far more kudos because they can say to the West, well, hang on a minute. Hello, America and other Western leaders. Guess what? We have all this information on your financial misdeeds. We're not going to tell the world about it. But we can keep them in secret, and it works for us. Because, after all, the individual mentioned in the documents are not the targets. The ones who are not mentioned are the targets. And, as ever, if Russia is behind the leakage, we can kind of know two things. First, if it's an operation run by the RFM, and it means it's run by Putin, it's ultimately in a form about holding a measure of control. Because as what Russia does very, very well, rather like the West, who likes to tell the world everything in 5 seconds, you reveal secrets to try and destroy people, but you conceal them in order to control. And Russia's very good at controlling. This is why people say, why doesn't he disclose all the information they have about 9/11? Well, they don't, because for one simple reason. They're able to sit there and say to the cabal, well, you're going to play ball with us, you're going to get out of Syria, you're going to get out of the Ukraine. Do you know why? Because we'll tell the world all the secrets we know about 9/11. Well, if they're Panama Papers, and we know it will absolutely implicate Western political leaders, probably also American corporations, American Kabbalists, etc., etc., and it could be pretty damning information. It would make far more sense to us for the West to take the blame for it. It appears as though the CIA or someone's leaked it, but Russia holds all the information, rather like the Snowden files, and when they want to, they can play their hand. But the greatest strength is in not playing your hand. And what's interesting, at the time all this came out, Putin decided to declassify all these archived documents, and he signed a decree, which was on the Kremlin website, ultimately, obviously in Russian, so it wasn't easy for people to translate. But he added that in these archives, he said, as far as I know, according to the information from archive agencies, this concerns the period from 1930 to 1989. And in these documents, there are cases, of snitches as well as the innocently repressed, with very interesting names. And some documents will surprise society. Well, we know there was a lot of meddling in that period of the cabal in Russia, from the days of Stalin and before that, also going through, obviously, the whole communist era. Communism was a Western construct. Obviously, 89 saw the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of communism, in inverted commas. But that period in history, it's interesting, he says, we're going to declassify these documents. Is there some tie-in with what's come out of the Panama Papers? Quite possibly. Some people will say, well, that's all very coincidental. Well, when I see things like that, I tend to see less coincidence and more some substantial fact. And I personally, which most people won't, but it's my view, that I think Russia's behind the Panama Papers leak. And they hold the whip hand, they hold all the information. And the West now knows they hold all the information, because they're not going to come out and say, we weren't responsible for this, the Russians were. They're never going to admit that. But privately, if they know full well they're not responsible, they're going to say, well, someone else is responsible. Is it possibly the Russians? They're going to be, maybe the Russians have told them. Rather like the Snowden files, we have all this information. And it's our way of control, not destroy. We control the situation. And what's the best way to? You don't fight the cabal by going into a war with them. You fight them by controlling them. And the control mechanism is information, it's intelligence. It's also financial and all the other aspects. And that's part of why de-dollarization is a way of control. It's a controlling mechanism to effectively squeeze the life force out of them in totality. And I think the Panama Papers is far more about that than some idea that, oh, hang on, we've got all this information to discredit people. But they're not in the West. But have you noticed how quickly that whole story died a death?
It's gone, hasn't it? It's gone completely. So what you're essentially saying, that the Panama Papers is an inside job, a little bit like, to give yourself a bloody nose and then blame it on your opponents.
Well, in a sense, yeah. I mean, Russia could. I mean, what's the blowback? Oh, Putin's a bad guy. Russia just laughs and goes, well, everyone in the West thinks that anyway, so what have we lost? Nothing. Oh, Assad's a nasty man. Well, yeah, the people in the West think that, oh, China's a really corrupt, nation. It's communist, it's this, that, and the other. Well, big deal. Everyone thinks that anyway. So what have these nations lost? Nothing. But what have the Western nations lost by? Because are we supposed to really believe there's no Western nations involved in these leaks, in all this information? Of course there is. And who stands to lose the most if that information comes out? Well, it certainly isn't Russia, China, and Syria and those nations. So, yeah, I think there's every reason to believe that's the case, and I have no doubt in my mind that's exactly what's happened.
It does make sense. It does make sense. I do believe we're having one or two technical problems on the website at the moment. I think people can still hear us. Is that right, Andy? It's just that they're not able to use the chat, and they won't be able to hear. Yeah, they can hear us though.
Yeah, it seems that way. And like I say, if anyone can't hear us, well, they won't be able to hear this. But if
If you
anyone
can't hear us, turn us up.
Yeah, if anyone's having difficulty with the site, and the chat room's obviously not functioning properly at the moment, but just go to Spreaker.com/user/Raconteurs News, and you will find the live show there.
You always bring trouble to us, Paul. Always bring trouble.
Yeah, I'm sorry
Very
about
interested. That's probably why you're our most popular guest.
Yes, you're bringing your Langley friends along with you.
Yes, yeah, they're just like sat on my shoulders, and I don't know. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but who knows?
No.
We'll call it that. We're coincidence theorists. That's what we are.
I'm pretty sure they're not that interested in what I have to say. But.
Oh well, I'm getting messages over Skype from Canada, and they can still hear us over there. So it looks like we're doing okay at the moment.
Yeah, it's just the website, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I just did a chat test about 10 minutes ago, and it's just popped up on the screen. So perhaps the chat is now working.
Really? Okay. Yeah.
What about what are the things that are developing and going on in Saudi Arabia, and the tense situation that we're shown that's supposed to be happening between the United States and Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting. I mean, today there was an official visit from Obama, who arrived in Saudi, but I think even perhaps more important, we'll talk about that in a second, but more important than that was that there was a former Saudi intelligence chief, Prince Al Faisal, who apparently told CNN today, and he said this: there's going to have to be a recalibration of our relationship with America. How far we can go with our dependence on America, how much can we rely on our steadfastness from American leadership? What is it that makes for our joint benefits to come together? He said, in a significant departure from usual Saudi rhetoric, there are things that we have to recalibrate. Now, it's quite unprecedented for this guy to go on CNN. Bear in mind, he makes the comments as Obama lands in Riyadh to a reception that kind of apparently the alternative media and social media critics termed a complete snub, and of course the US officials strongly disputed this. But let's put this in context. The Saudi government dispatched this governor of Riyadh and a foreign minister to welcome Obama and shake his hand at the airport. And that was a departure from the scene at the airport hours earlier when King Salman was shown on state television greeting the leaders of other Gulf nations as they arrived at the airport. There's clearly a huge tense relationship now between Saudi and the US, and I don't think there's any coincidence Obama's arrived when he's arrived to try and smooth things over. Now, we touched earlier on, obviously Saudi were part of the relationship that saw the birth of the petrodollar, and in return for Saudi selling all its oil in dollars, they got all this military hardware and support in protecting the House of Saud. Well, we talked about this in the past, that the House of Saud is very weak now. I suspect it won't survive an awful lot longer. I'm quite surprised in some ways it's survived as long as it has. And of course, the tension between the US and Saudi does a number of reasons, but we've lately seen this whole story about, well, the US is going to expose Saudi's responsibility for 9/11, and apparently in return Saudi basically said, we're going to dump US all our assets and we'll take the US economy down. So this kind of economic war of words. Well, what's kind of interesting is we don't know exactly, but Saudi has trillions of US treasuries. From what I understand, Saudi can't dump them because the US no one will buy them, and the US, as a kind of last resort, has to buy them, is refusing. I mean, it's except dumping dollars from everybody else, trying to hide the fact he's refused to do so with the Saudis. We know for a fact that all the Saudi gold was stolen by the US cabal. There's no doubt if you look in the Middle East, Saudi was puffing its chest out regarding Syria, along with Turkey, saying they were going to have ground force invasion into the nation and they were going to deal with Assad. And of course, we said that would never happen. Unsurprisingly, it never did happen. But the US effectively, as far the Saudis, as far as they were concerned, the US turned their back on them and have allowed Assad to remain in power, and they've done nothing. And we know Saudis fighting a proxy war in Yemen, which is really a cabal proxy war because there's massive oil reserves there which the cabal want to get their hands on. They're not going to succeed, but Saudi, by fighting this proxy war, is deeply damaging for them in the Middle East, and also is significantly weakening an already very weak House of Saud. So, yeah, undoubtedly, Saudi Arabia and the US relationship is weakening rapidly, and this is another hugely important development because Saudi was a very, very strong cabal vassal state and has been, as we said, since the birth of the petrodollar. That relationship's weakening because the US feel in part that the Saudis were responsible for smashing the oil price, which has caused deeply damaging effects. And we've talked about oil, and actually, probably something a bit later, we can talk about a big oil scandal that's broken in the last couple of weeks. They were believed to be responsible for trying to smash the oil price in some vain attempt to destroy the Russians, but of course that failed. But the side effect of that is that they've killed the shale oil industry in the US, and even traditional oil producers are suffering massively because of the oil price. We know there's been a bit of a rally in the oil price, but that's all smoke and mirrors and is nonsense anyway, because supply demand is dictating that the Iranians are flooding the market with cheap oil and continue to increase production. Russia said they're not going to cut production, and in fact they'll probably increase it. And this whole Doha meeting, which was supposed to try and achieve some equilibrium and try and stabilise the oil price, collapsed. Saudis were blaming the Americans, ironically, of all things. So we're clearly seeing, and I don't see why the Americans would want to prevent that happening, because it's in their interest to see the oil price rise significantly, 50, 60, whatever, $70 a barrel minimum. So, yeah, that relationship is very tense, but it's a hugely significant cabal relationship, and it shows, as we've said, not only have the cabal lost the war in Syria, but the relationship between Saudi and America is very weak and strained, and I very much doubt Obama governor is going to achieve anything. I think Obama will leave pretty much how he arrived. Yes, definitely snubbed.
And there's also the question of isn't there a group of family members, survivors from 9/11 family members, who are putting pressure on the government to release documents which indicate Saudi in 9/11?
Yes, I mean, there's supposed to be this huge indictment of Saudi, but I mean, that's a bit of a sideshow as well. Okay, there might be some Saudi involvement, but we know for a fact that the Bush administration full well knew what was going on and were complicit in this. And of course, the argument might be, well, if this document is released, then not only is Saudi going to take some economic retribution, but I think it's very likely they're just going to implicate certain figures in the Bush administration for their responsibility in 9/11 as well. So, yes, the Americans are under intense pressure to do so, because there's an argument rightly that says, well, we want full disclosure on this from relations of people who lost family members and friends in 9/11, who want that information. But the Americans are going to be pretty reluctant to do it, not just because of the ramifications of who will be implicated in this within their own nation, but also because economically Saudi might try and attempt to wage some kind of war by selling assets and trying to deeply damage the US. I'm not sure that will be particularly successful either. And it's like one of these two things when you see two nations like slugging it out together. There's only one outcome. They're both going to end up being damaged deeply. So from a sort of cabal standpoint, it's great to see these nations at each other's throats, and it is hugely indicative of the weakness when they are starting to have so much infighting as they are now.
Yeah, and I just wanted to make this final point, that if they carry on slugging it out, that there's also the United States have also got to consider Israel and their position in that region and how it would affect them.
Well, we always come back to this point of, and I've said this many, many times before, Israel in recent times has been so quiet, it's incredible. Given what's been going on, they've said very little, they're remaining very quiet. There's talk of signing or trade agreements secretly. They seem to be working with Putin. I think Putin went there and essentially told them that they were to keep a low profile, keep their head down, and not get involved in the way they have been with respect to Middle Eastern policy. I mean, we're seeing how nations are beginning to side with the whole Palestinian question. Russia said they want resolution. China does. I think there's going to be huge pressure on Israel to toe the line, and we're seeing even how the Americans are now publicly criticizing. I think it was Biden publicly came out criticizing Netanyahu. I mean, this is incredible that we're seeing American cabal trying to effectively now discredit Israel, who was a key ally. But this is what's happening. When cabal factions get weaker and weaker and weaker, they're going to start tearing strips off each other. And ultimately that's beneficial to everyone else, because in the process they are going to rip each other limb from limb, and at some point one of them is very likely to be the catalyst for like this kind of wholesale disclosure of something, and then the kind of backbiting and backstabbing and ultimately that stabbing in the front is going to happen as well, and ultimately that will probably bring about disclosure.
Paul,
9/11 is a good example of that. Very likely.
We're having problems here in that we've got two versions of the show going at the minute, so I'll put on a quick tune and see if we can get it sorted, and we'll be back in about 4 minutes, folks.
The scene of the crime, they're working overtime. They're fueling the fire, feeding the wire. What sounds like a crime is a house of lies. I'm still looking for one good and honest person for hire. Down by the riverside, no one's do or die. Shopping carts, bottles passed around, open fire. Further up the Nile lives the king of denial. Let's start the trial. Somewhere in between, there's gasoline, electricity, fueled by television screen. Closets full of pockets attached to every string, attached to hearts that are struggling to sing. Time is everything, it's the only thing. What the harvest brings, the joy we sing. To tell me who rocked the boat, who rocked the boat, who will rock the boat. Stand up, yeah. Who will rock the boat? Who will rock the boat? Who will rock the boat? No, who will rock the boat? Who will rock the boat? Don't back down, don't crave, but no crowd, no false story, no glory, no more children going hungry, no more begging on your knees, no more please, 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 no walls, no war, no more settling the score, no more rich man favors, never favoring the poor. All the people take the street, bring the rhythm, bring the beat, electrified, intensified, mystified and true. Try to, you want the sunshine, here come the sunshine. Oh, you want the sunshine, yeah, here come the sunshine. Coca-Cola, dirty, our days are getting harder. They came for the fuel, now they come for the water. It's the desiring, the choice we make, what the harvest brings, the joy we sing. So tell me who will rock the boat, 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 who will rock the boat. Stand up, stand up.
Are we back on live?
Are we back on, Andy? Hello and welcome to Raconteurs News. We are back live. Andy's forgotten to turn his microphone on. I don't think he thinks he needs it. We've had one or two gremlins this evening, but we've seemed to have sorted the... Tony, should I say, has seemed to have sorted the chat room out, so the chat room seems to be working. We don't know how long it's going to work. We don't know what's really been going on. But Tony, bless him, top guy. He's on the case, and if anybody can do it, it's certainly him. Have you got your mic back on now, Andy?
I have got my mic back on, yes.
There we go.
I was wondering why you couldn't hear me and couldn't work it out.
Right, I think a good point is to mention what's been going on for many years with dollar-yen kind of trade. And the reason I think it's worth mentioning is it's kind of something that's been a huge influence in the gold price, and I'll explain what's been going on and why it's now significant. What we've actually seen since about 2012, well, essentially 3.5 years or so, is the price of gold largely has been under this paper market system solely by fluctuations in the yen. So if the yen goes down, again, i.e. the yen depreciates against the dollar, the price of gold goes down. If the yen appreciates against the dollar, the price of gold goes up. And of course, in the mix of that is this computer-driven algo trade, which effectively is long the US dollar against the Japanese yen and short the gold. And we've also seen where banks and hedge funds are running a parallel kind of pair trade of the yen, but also the S&P. Now, if anybody really wants to look into this, and there is numerous, you can see a clear correlation since 2012 where the yen started to depreciate versus the dollar at a rapid rate. And at that time, the S&P 500 embarked on this huge kind of upward trajectory that took it from a value of about 1,099 in around October 2012 to an all-time high of 2130 in May 2015. And of course, we saw from in 2011 where gold was at 1900 and ended up going all the way down to 1050, and obviously it's rallied subsequently in 2016. But what happened in around August last year, this yen dollar began to break down technically. So what we started to see at that point as well is that there was a fall in the S&P 500. And very recently, of course, the dollar yen went below 110, which is supposed to be some key critical technical areas, and it got as low as 180. It's just below 110 now. Now, the question obviously came to my mind is, why did it start to break down? I mean, this was obviously a big carry trade. It was a way of hedge funds and banks and also central banks controlling markets, controlling the price of gold in the way they did. But that started to significantly break down, and we're even seeing now where gold's going up, and the yen actually is appreciating. So we've kind of seen this complete breakdown in this trade, which obviously was hugely significant. Now, obviously what we've seen lately for the last year or two, the Fed and the White House and all the media saying the US economy is doing really well, and that the Feds are going to hike interest rates in 2016 2 or 3 or 4 times, whatever they think it is. And they're also saying, oh, Japan's economy is contracting, and the Bank of Japan, as we know, floods the system with QE, makes the Western QE look trivial. But so if what we should be seeing is the dollars should be appreciating against the yen, and it's not. So obviously something big has blown up in the global financial system to cause this unpredictable instability and loss of control via the Fed's manipulation. So when people say, oh, the cabal is still in control financially, the cabal are dictating the Fed, there's nothing wrong with the Federal Reserve law, everything's just carrying on as normal. Well, it absolutely isn't, and this trade proves it. And anyone can go and find the data out that supports exactly what I've said. It's not speculation; it's absolutely 100% provable. Now, what are the likely culprits for this? Well, it can be a number of things. It can be failing banks, where they're trying to support a bank. There's a lot of talk about Deutsche Bank. Its share price has kind of started to move back up, but it's been manipulated. But we know Deutsche Bank's got serious problems, despite its all the rhetoric to the contrary. It may be some other significant financial event that it's not exactly clear what's causing it. But what we're seeing with gold, and okay, there's a bit of an attempt to smash it today, but the past 3 months it's risen hugely, and a lot of their attempts to really smash it. I mean, 50 tons of paper contract of gold is huge, and it didn't make that much of a dent on the price. And we therefore have to really, as we come back to it, what exactly is going on with central banks? And I think actually the bottom line is, we've seen the end of cabal central bank control. I think they no longer possess that ability to control, as they have done for a great number of years, but particularly in the last few years since kind of 2008, 2009, to try and manipulate currencies, manipulate gold, keep the strength of the dollar. We're seeing cracks in that, and they're now becoming far more than cracks, big chasms. And I think that's why people say nothing's happening, and I appreciate it's not something that would be familiar and obvious to people. But the fact of mentioning it is simply because it is hugely significant, and it's hugely indicative of central bank failure to control policy anymore. And people always say, well, they can have huge bailouts, and I don't think those days have gone. They're not possible. Yeah, we talked about bail-ins. Yeah, they've talked long and hard about bail-ins. But thus far, that is not really a realistic proposition. They do have lost control, and the Fed. Let's go back. We had very recently, just prior to the gold yuan, where the Fed had those 3 days of expedited meetings. The content of what those meetings were not clear. It was pretty quiet. The first day involved the Fed, and then Biden and Obama and the Fed had a meeting, which is just unprecedented. There's never happens where you have those 3 people. You might have Obama and the Fed or Biden and the Fed, but not all 3 of them in the same room discussing apparent economic policy. Is clearly indicative that they have lost control. Now, does that mean instantly overnight we're going to see the collapse of the cabal and the financial system? No. But it's certainly hugely indicative that they now no longer possess, and by their own admission they use this word, we no longer have any tools to deal with the economic problems. They are largely just treading water at the very best. I think they're starting to sink. And the yuan gold fix, I think, was probably the reason they had the meeting, because it revolves around 3 things principally, really, at the moment. It's gold, silver, and oil. I mean, the oil price got smashed. Yeah, it's recovered. people say, oh, well, that means the cabal are back in charge. No, it doesn't. It doesn't mean anything. The real oil economic position has not changed. Oil might be at $42, $43 a barrel currently. Is it really selling for that in the open market? Absolutely not. Iran's selling it at a fraction of the price. And they're flooding the market with cheap oil. So this is just a game to preserve their derivatives. But, you know, we always come back, oil's a big player in this, but for me, gold and silver always has been the real kind of crunch for the cabal. And back to the yuan gold fix, which we started with, I think that is why it's a significant move. And I think that's principally probably why there was a realisation to have these 3 expedited meetings over 3 successive days by the Fed, because there's a realisation they have lost control now, and they no longer possess. And if they lose complete control of the paper market in gold, and physical gold does become the dominant factor via China and ultimately reforms in the LBMA, I think the COMEX probably will disappear. I think the LBMA is desperately trying to reform because it doesn't want to die, and okay, that's fair enough. If they can reform and do things correctly, that's all well and good. But I think that has become a key battleground, and of course it is a key battleground, because if we're going to have gold-backed currency, then obviously that is the future. So this is why that whole kind of dollar-yen gold trade and what's been going on and why it broke down is clearly indicative. And all these various aspects for me are all linked together.
Mm-hmm. We have got a question that you neatly put in the chat room a while back, and it's a bit of an essay, so I've been waiting to try and squeeze it in.
No,
Lee said, I was thinking about this when Mike Maloney was speaking about the system being overdue for a new currency. What I think he's missing is that we're not overdue. We do have a new currency. It's digital, cashless, that has come in, and no one seems to have noticed. And they're all waiting for this new currency, whatever it may look like, to come in. People are missing the obvious. Does the guest agree?
No, I don't. I don't agree that this whole cashless society thing. I mean, the other week, the Bundesbank came out and said, cashless society, absolutely not. It will never happen. No, I mean, from a cabal perspective, I always come back, the reason there will always be cash in a cabal world is because the biggest cash cow is the drugs industry. If you were to remove cash and have a cashless society, their drugs industry would collapse. They can't afford to do that. And that's just one simple example why. And as the Bundesbank pointed out, it's people's right if they want to pay with cash, but equally we talk about a cashless society. How many people now pay for things in cash? How many people actually just use a card to pay for their groceries, their whatever else they might want to purchase in the high street? A lot of people use direct debits to pay their bills. I mean, largely the whole concept of cash and people using cash is largely diminished. And this idea, well, if we have a cashless society, they can just cut us off and take control of banks. Well, they could do that anyway, whether we have a cashless society or not. They can just close the banks if they really wanted to. So no, I don't hold any think this cashless society holds any water. When the Bundesbank comes out and says it's absolutely not going to happen, and China and Russia going to have a cashless society? No. I mean, we've got to bear in mind the BRICS and the Alliance of Nations now accounts for 70% of the world's population. They're not buying any of this. So is this cashless society going to happen in Europe? Well, Germany said absolutely not. Or is it going to happen in the UK? Don't think so. Is it going to happen in the US? I mean, if it's a cashless society, is it going to be one country or two or maybe three? Yeah. Is that even going to happen? No, I just don't see it. And I don't think the cabal needs to ever, and bear in mind the cabal is on a borrowed time and is a spent for, but even if they were to succeed, do they need to have a cashless society? No, of course they don't. And if they want to destroy their drugs industry, then have a cashless society. But they wouldn't do that for that just for me alone, for that very reason.
Yeah, it does. It doesn't seem to make sense. Like you say, the drugs industry is dependent on cash, but as you said, the 97, I think it's 97% of money isn't cash at all. It's not physical. So we're down to like a 3% cash of all the money that's circulating throughout the world. So I suppose we're getting towards not the cashless society, but a society where where the cash transactions are a fraction of what goes on.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and that's the subtle difference. Yeah, I mean, cash doesn't play a part. Doesn't mean it's a cashless society. If you know, or anyone else wanted to go and draw out their money and pay all their bills in cash and walk round with, you know, however much money they've got in their pocket, they're perfectly entitled to do so. It wouldn't make much sense to do that. But you know, if you want to do that, fine, you can do that. If you want to draw all your wages out every month and pay all your bills, you know, however you want to pay them, and go to, you know, your local supermarket and buy your groceries that way, fine, just do that. I mean, some people do pay, but predominantly people don't, and that's the subtle difference. Yeah, we do largely don't use cash because there's no requirement. And do I personally, does it bother me that I don't pay for things in cash? Well, no. Why do I need to? I mean, there's odd things I might go and buy. You know, I'm not going to go into a newsagent to buy something for £2 and pay with a card. You know, I'll always have a bit, but predominantly do I use cash myself? No. But there is, as you rightly point out, there's a big difference between a cashless society and a society that rarely uses cash for transactions.
Mm. Yeah, and it's and like you said, the narcotics, that is the big. Well, I suppose it's the way that they keep hold of a lot of the cash.
Well, in a sense, of course, how the distribution works is they make their profit further up the food chain, and it's the little guy down below who's the one who ends up getting busted and spending 10 years or 5 years or whatever in prison and earns a pittance from it. But, you know, ultimately, if they didn't have the end supply chain to sell these products into the market, then the industry would collapse. And what are they going to do? They're not going to stand on a street corner with a 10-ton truck trying to sell it out the back of it. I mean, it's just, you know, that wouldn't happen. I mean, there's this idea, well, they can legalise the drug trade. Well, yes, they can legalise the drug trade, but if it would, why didn't they do it decades ago? If they could still make profitable or be as profitable as they can be when it isn't legalised? Because we know exactly why it isn't legalised, because it benefits them hugely financially not to do so. So yeah. No, I don't see that as being a viable option. And given where we are in proceedings, I'd be very surprised if you really want to think the cabal might try one insane thing, which will really completely destroy them. The only thing they potentially got left, which they could do, is to say, well, okay, we're just going to print trillions and trillions of dollars. Or what would that do? It would just financially wreck everything and destroy themselves in the process. And that's the only option they've got left. Are they going to do that? No, I don't think they will. And the only way they might do it is if they literally are 5 minutes from exiting out the door, they might try something insane, but it would never work. It would simply, all people remember them as is the lunatics who took the financial system down. The one thing they're trying to desperately do is not appear to be the ones causing the problem. So hence, let's blame China's weak economy that, of course, isn't weak. Let's blame Russia. They're responsible. Everyone else is responsible but themselves. So they're not going to do anything as insane as that, but that is the only option they've got left realistically, and of course it's not a realistic option for them to undertake, from my perspective anyway.
Okay, you did say you wanted to come back to big oil, and this is the story that I've noticed that perhaps might lead into that, and it's the tax affairs of Royal Dutch Shell, and it appears that far from taxing Shell, Britain has actually paid the oil giant an £85 million rebate.
Yes, well, indeed. That story's just broken very recently. It exactly proves the problem that we have in the UK and other nations where big corporations simply don't pay the tax they're supposed to pay. And in fact, in that case, they're getting a rebate. And the question should be asked, well, why are they getting a rebate? Why aren't these big corporations paying tax? Okay, there's all this big scandal breaks about the Panama Papers. Let's set aside about, this person were, made, okay, let's look at Cameron. Cameron didn't do anything illegal, and he makes a profit on the deal. Okay, so he makes a profit on the deal. He didn't do anything. Okay, there's an argument he should have declared it straight away. Yeah, of course he should have. But then we see these massive corporations through tax loopholes avoiding, and no one seems to pay any attention to that. And you've rightly highlighted something, Andy, that's come out regarding Shelwyn. That doesn't, stir some kind of feeling of what the hell is really going on. I mean, is it going to get buried and disappear? Very likely it will do. But you're absolutely right. That actually feeds in that there's recently been this massive oil scandal that broke. It didn't get massive amounts of reporting, but I think I'm getting feedback in my ear again, by the way. But there was an investigation into this massive global oil bribery scandal. It's been launched by authorities in the US, Britain and Australia after, surprise, surprise, leaked confidential files indicated that some of the world's most powerful corporations were part of this racket. And this global investigation came because this kind of biggest leak of confidential files in the history of the oil industry, I think it was obtained by the Huffington Post, and it unveiled widespread corruption taking place, oddly enough, in oil-rich countries. Now, apparently the first report that will be released was some dodgy dealings in the Middle East and North Africa, and then there's going to be some alleged corruption that was carried on in former Soviet states, so not Russia itself. And the final focuses on Asia and other parts of Africa. And apparently the reports revealed that government contracts worth kind of billions of dollars were awarded on the basis of bribes. And many of them were organised by this fixer company, who I'm not going to mention because these are all allegations, and frankly, who cares? But outside the oil industry, this company had never been. No one has even heard of them. I mean, for what it's worth, and that might not be much. I'd certainly not heard of them either. But apparently, they've been participating in these illegal deals, convincing Western corporations that they'll not be able to get contracts in oil-rich companies without its help. And this company stands accused of being kind of a lobbyist and charging major companies multi-million-dollar fees in exchange for bribing government officials in order to get deals for corporations, solid deals. And the major international companies are across the US, Europe, Asia and Australia, and have been taking part with this unnamed company. But it says that this unnamed company obviously weren't the only party at fault. These documents kind of indicate that many of the corporations have known exactly what was happening, and it lists a whole bunch of companies, and there are a lot of familiar ones, but it's incredible. They're all over. They're just big corporations globally, and there's weapons corporations. There's actually food companies and electronics companies and oil companies, and the publications include apparently hundreds of thousands of emails sent from the chief executive of this company that show managers and executives from various companies knew or suspected that this unnamed company was acting illegally to win contracts in Kazakhstan, which is a former Soviet. And the list goes on and on and on. Well, this oil scandal is far more than just an oil scandal. It shows the extent. And it's a great way of showing what corporations are really up to in a far broader sense. And they're actually involved in areas. And you go, why the hell are some of these big electronic corporations involved in some dodgy global oil bribery scandal? Well, it shows just how closely knit these enormous corporations are and what they're involved in. And the fact we're starting to get this leakage. We're seeing leaks everywhere. I mean, Snowden files started. Panama Papers is another example. But this is another example of a huge leak, and then the suggestions of leaking 9/11 and the dossier of information that's going to implicate Saudi and whoever else is involved. But I'm expecting this oil scandal. We'll see if it, and another one that someone tries to bury and it'll die a death, but I suspect it won't. But of course, given that authorities, how long it's going to take, it might take a year or two before we hear anything, but certainly there is massive investigations going on, which is going to uncover a huge network of bribery and corruption amongst a huge amount of corporations. I don't know the exact list, but I've seen a list of 20 or 30 names, and there's probably a damn sight more than that, maybe 60, 80, 100, who knows, but it is very indicative of another huge aspect of cabal corruption that's going on globally.
Yeah, we got loads of questions coming in the chat rooms. We've got Jimmy's just asked a question. How the launch of the gold-backed yuan changed the field of play in the economies of the world? So how will the launch of the gold-backed yuan, if there is going to be a launch of a gold-backed yuan, how will that change the field of play in the economies of the world?
Well, obviously, yeah, the gold-backed yuan will come eventually, rather like the gold-backed ruble. Of course, a gold-backed currency is the antidote to what we've had, which is just fiat currencies backed by nothing, and we've seen where nations just print whatever money they want to resolve whatever problem they think. It's backed by nothing. So to have a gold-backed currency means that it will create economic stability, because nations will trade. For example, let's say China and Russia trade with each other, and there's one nation's likely to import more than the other one, so at the end of the quarterly, half-yearly, yearly period, they can trade up and say, okay, well, you owe us this much money and we can pay you in gold. We're likely to see these gold trade settlements happening. People say, well, what's the point, because gold has no value, but it does. If you look historically for 2,000 years and more, a loaf of bread priced in gold is pretty much the same 2,000 years ago as it is now. Now, that doesn't give you an indication of real economic value. Nothing does. We know, look at what's happened to the purchasing power of the dollar since the advent of the Federal Reserve. It's worth about 2% of what it was. That's inflation. That's caused by a fiat currency system. So, yeah, of course, this is what's going to underpin the whole basis of the financial system in the future, which is why China and other nations, of course, Russia and others, have been stockpiling enormous quantities of gold. And we're seeing lately, and I've just spoken earlier in the last 6 months about how much silver the Shanghai Silver Exchange has been acquiring, enormous quantities. Why? Because they're going to back currencies in the global financial system with silver, which also has intrinsic value, and that's why the cabal have destroyed the price of gold, destroyed the price of silver, to protect their phony, fake, Ponzi-driven Federal Reserve note. That's the biggest indication of why gold and silver is that important to a new financial system, because it's the antidote to everything that the cabal financial system is. And it is going to come about. How quickly is a very good question, but certainly the gold price fix that the Shanghai Gold Exchanges are now denominated in yuan is a really important step. The accumulation of gold by nations is another important step, and the de-dollarization is another important step. And how trade agreements between nations are now being signed in non-dollar terms is hugely important. Why we're seeing all these big trade deals, and we've seen lately where India, Russia and China are talking about working together extensively. We're seeing a kind of amalgamation of BRICS into a proper alliance, and it's not just the BRICS nations. There are many other nations who are affiliates to this and working, and that's why they're all signing trade deals with Russia, China, India, and all these nations. And now, of course, we're seeing Iran join. And even though they're not part of the BRICS, they're very much what I call the fourth leg of the new Silk Road, which, for those people who've not listened before, is obviously Berlin, Moscow, Beijing, and obviously Tehran. So, yeah, it's hugely significant and hugely important going forward.
Mm-hmm. And on the subject of gold-backed currency, Lee's asking, can the guest really envision giving their populace gold to trade with in their daily lives, or will it still be paper tokens with a perceived value based on some yellow metals held in a vault somewhere?
No, the whole basis of the gold industry in the future, that's why the Shanghai Gold Exchange is, if you go and buy an ounce of gold, you'll pay, let's say the price is, I don't know, $1,250 for an ounce currently, or whatever. If you buy it in China, it's whatever the current exchange rate is, or whatever it's priced in you at. When you buy that, you will physically be allocated an ounce of silver. You own it. If you want to take ownership of it and take the ounce of silver, you take it. You can store it. They can, store it for you. You can take it and put it in your house. You can put it in a vault in the bank. Do whatever you want with it. It physically exists. The current gold system in the West, particularly in the COMEX, is, and like today, someone dumps 50 tons of gold. That doesn't exist. It's a paper. It's designed to smash the price. It's backed by nothing. It's just paper gold. No, it's real physical metal. And we will see the LBMA will become purely that as well. COMEX, I don't think will survive. I think it will die. It might survive or be reborn, but the future of gold trading will be, you buy an ounce of gold, you own an ounce of gold. You buy an ounce of silver, you own an ounce. There isn't going to be some paper. It's not going to be ETF-driven and paper-driven. So, no, it very much will be very, very different. And that's why this gold price fix and what the Shanghai Gold Exchange represent is the very antidote to the paper fiasco we've seen with gold and silver.
Very good. Well, what would the effect be of this gold-backed currency? Surely that would mean the end of inflation.
Well, yes. I mean, to a large extent, yes, of course, because what's caused the inflation is, and if you look, I mean, yes, you can still have inflation, but it stops just the wanton printing of money backed by nothing. I mean, at some point, yes, you're going to have an issue with price inflation. I mean, that's a very complicated thing, and you could talk for 4 hours about it and how we're going to manage things in the future in the financial system. But we have to start by having a financial system that's backed by something of value. People will argue, there'll be people arguing for the next 10 years that gold's worth nothing. There are always going to be people who don't agree with that. Well, okay, that's fine, don't agree with it. But when you have a financial system that's underpinned, it will. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Central banks have to be reformed or shut or something done to them, because look at what's happened in the US. Is it any secret the US dollar, as I said, is worth 2% of what it was? And that all stemmed from the period of when the Federal Reserve came into existence. So, yeah, it will resolve many of those problems. I mean, quite how things are going to... I mean, this is a very complicated thing, and I'm be true. I don't understand every aspect of it because I don't know every aspect that's happening. For the simple reason is it's not information we're privy to, but most certainly we have to get certain fundamental principles resolved, and other things will have to follow in the future.
Yeah, we got another question from Unique Lee in the chat room. It says, what if people have no gold when the system reverts to it? Will the public even get any warnings? It'll switch over, maybe over time, or it'll transition?
No, gold-backed currency doesn't mean if you have £100 in the bank, it's going to be £100. There is this argument: well, is the currency going to devalue? Well, in the UK's case, how much gold has the UK got? Don't know. Is it going to lease gold from China? Maybe, or probably will do. Or what's going to happen to the US? Are they going to lease gold? Yes, most certainly. Or if they don't, they're going to be in big trouble. So, yeah, currencies can devalue as a result of their apparent lack of worth, and maybe $100 becomes $80, or £100 becomes £90. But currency devaluation is something entirely different, because if you devalue a currency, then obviously you have problems with imports, but from an export potential, becomes very cheap, and the internal economy becomes significantly cheaper. So it's not a simple question of, well, what's going to happen? Is the change going to happen? Well, this is a really interesting question, and it's something actually in the last week or two Lisa and I have talked about quite a bit. there's this big idea there's going to be these, huge changes. I don't think it's going to collapse for a week or 2 or 6 or 10 or whatever it is. And I don't know, because I really have no idea precisely. But I'm starting to see a lot of things happening that I didn't expect to happen before a collapse. Now, does that mean they're trying to mitigate this to a large extent? I think that is the case. Does it mean they will succeed? We don't know. Is there a degree of confidence that that will happen? I guess to some degree, yeah. I have heard of plans to mitigate problems going back a few years, but there's nothing to substantiate that. And that was in European nations, for example. So it is, we are largely in the dark to some extent, but I am seeing encouraging signs that I don't think there's going to be this complete implosion. But was this what I call the Berlin Wall moment, when everything changes and people realise in the world that the world has changed? Yes, will. It's not necessarily going to be some catastrophic event, but at some point people are going to realise that the world has changed out of all recognition, because they're going to start seeing themselves tangible changes in their lifestyle, in the very things we know that have destroyed most people in this world, except unless you're in the very 0.001%, not the 1%, significantly less than that. We will start to see those fundamental changes in people's lifestyle, the lifestyle choices, how people feed themselves, how people are able to go out and work and do the things they're good at, and have obviously have a meritocracy, as opposed to what we have now, where we could have some great politicians out there who are never going to be politicians, great artists who'll never be able to paint a picture, write an album, write a novel, whatever they might be capable in all walks of life. We need to have that meritocracy, because we know in every nation there's great people who never get that opportunity. So, and yet there will be financial changes. Is our banks going to collapse? Well, I can't see how they can't, but will they mitigate something to stop the collapse? And I'm not talking to stop a cabal collapse. How's that going to be managed? That's very difficult. We've talked about this before. It's not clear. And even the people I talk to truthfully say, I don't know. We don't really know exactly how things are going to pan out, because I was talking about the ghosts, and I've talked about it on the Facebook page a lot. There are these ghosts. They're the ones who know what's going on. They're a very small number. They don't tend to talk. They certainly don't tell people like me what's going on to that level. And I actually know a ghost in that. So they don't tell me what's going on. I'll say, well, what about this? And they'll go, look, it's very complicated. We can't discuss it. So don't even ask. And of course, you reach a point where it's better not to ask, because some things are best not known. So that's not ideal. But if you were privy to certain information, then I think that makes you potentially a threat to certain entities in this world. And truthfully, I don't want to be seen. I mean, we can say, oh, the show gets interrupted because of so-and-so, and maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But I'm not some perceived threat. But if I came out and was privy to certain information and making comments, which actually I'm not privy to, but if I was, then that's like shining the brightest torch in the world on me, saying, hello, look at me, and I know this, and that wouldn't be very sensible from my perspective, and talking about it on here would be insanity. So.
Insanity, I think we've had tonight, haven't we? Just about had everything else. One quick question I wanted to ask you. Bearing in mind recent events, what sort of state are Japan in financially? And, how are they going to be fixed for being able to repair their country after these earthquakes that have been going on?
Yeah, well, let's talk about the earthquakes. I mean, there's a lot of talk, the cabal have been responsible, and then there's a lot of people saying the seismic signature, they're just genuine earthquakes. It's entirely possible. I mean, yeah, we can see clearly that Japan has been a vassal state since the end of World War II. I mean, it's no secret that Japan had already surrendered when Nagasaki and Fukushima. There's no doubt these events were already planned, and didn't matter when they surrendered or what they did. It was inevitable there was going to be, these bombs were going to be dropped on them. There was the argument of what happened in 2011 with Fukushima, where it was caused by the cabal. So the natural tendency to say, well, Japan's rotating away. We're seeing they are definitely trying to build bridges with China. They most certainly have with Russia. they're trying to sign trade deals and certainly rotate away from the vassal status of with the US. In terms economically, well, Japan's the biggest train wreck in the world because, I mean, that was doing QE before QE was on anyone's tongue. I mean, we talk about QE to infinity. I think the QE to infinity squared. I mean, so they have massive financial problems. How are they going to dig their way out of it? Very good question. Are they a nation that's likely to bring the rest of the world down? I very much doubt it. But they do have massive financial problems now. Are they secretly talking behind the scenes to China? It's a possibility. But they're another one. Rather like Saudi's a key vassal state, Japan's a key vassal state, and they're involved in some pretty shady stuff and the kind of things. Someone asked me on the Facebook post, I said, it's about an industry we're not going to talk about, and they are involved in that industry which we don't talk about, where money ends up and it goes through various hands and it ends up being back in the Bush administration, because obviously the Bush administration largely controlled or has, or to some extent still does control Japan, but they're certainly breaking away. But economically, they're an absolute train wreck because they've had, well, they've now got negative interest rates, and the Bank of Japan persists when, in fact, negative interest rates is destroying their financial system. They've had QE to infinity squared, etc. And yet they're in massive problems. And how do they dig their way out of it is a good question. I don't think they'll pull everything down, but they're certainly going to have huge problems. And they're going to need to rely on those very nations who they've had, through their vassal states, they've had nothing to do with. And I think that they represent some huge challenges for them as a nation. And yeah, by the way, I just said Nagasaki and Fukushima for 45 the bomb. No, it was obviously not. It was Hiroshima. So I apologise for that mistake, which I realised as I said it.
Oh, sorry, we got all kinds of crazy stuff going on here, Paul. That slipped right by me, that one.
It really is a shame to see, because Japan used to be such an international power, all the, an economic power, and all the best stuff, as they say in Back to the Future, all the best stuff's made in Japan, and it seems that they just seem to be hit by disaster after disaster. And I would imagine the tsunami and the earthquake from 2011 would have cost. Well, it would have made rebuilding Hiroshima and Nagasaki look like chicken feed. So it's no wonder they're in such a dire financial straits.
Well, yeah, I mean, you think back in the 80s, I mean, look at all the white goods that Japan made a huge kind of, we talk about Norway and its huge oil fund through oil sales it raised. And, well, Japan had huge white goods. I mean, they had a huge kind of, inventory of goods they sold. I mean, anyone remembers, I remember products, I mean, everything was Japanese at that point, whatever you wanted to buy, white goods, and they did have a huge financial war chest available, but of course that started to rapidly evaporate, and there's this whole Abenomics financial system which has destroyed Japan, and there's no doubt Cabal wanted to destroy Japan, and they've largely succeeded in doing it. And they did. I mean, the irony is, Abe's still Japan's prime minister, and he turned an economic recovery into a complete train wreck. And somehow he survived, and survives to this day. But yeah, I mean, Japan's leading the way in showing what QE and zero interest and negative interest rate policy does to a nation. It absolutely destroys it. And when the IMF comes out and talks about negative interest rates is the solution, well, okay, if they think it's the solution, we go back to the point, well, if you want to get everyone to take their money out of the bank and spend, because that will stimulate the economy, all you're going to do, in fact, actually is cause everyone to draw their money out of the banks, cause bank liquidity issues and crash the financial system. So, yeah, that's a great policy. I mean, that's economics 101 to the point of insanity, and people will argue, why does the IMF say it? there is an IMF. Well, the IMF says this because it's part of the cabal. No, do you know what? Genuinely, I just don't think these people really have a clue what needs to be done. It isn't just the fact that they are doing something to wreck things. I don't really genuinely believe the cabal decided. And people say, "Oh, well, they want to destroy the financial system." Well, if they did, why didn't they just take it down in 2008 when they could do? They had a perfect excuse. They could have crashed the big banks, taken it all down. They couldn't, because that wasn't their intention. And of course, ironically, it was nothing to do with them why that happened. So they simply make very bad decisions because they're not actually capable of making sensible economic decisions and to resolve problems. So all they do is dig a bigger hole for themselves by lowering and lowering and lowering interest rates. In Japan, that's proved you can't do anything about it. Once you have zero interest rates, you're stuck with them forever. Or in their case, you've now got negative interest rate.
Thank you, Paul. We are nearing the end of the 2 hours, and unfortunately, because the show's now filling up, we can't run on to the 3 hours. Have you got any final things you'd like to say to us? And obviously, we'll give you time to give out your links to your website and your group as well.
Okay, yeah, I think one thing we can kind of briefly touch on has been, people say, well, what kind of developments? We've seen a huge amount of developments going on in Europe, but I'd like to focus on maybe just a couple. I mean, the Dutch referendum about the European trade union deal, obviously the Dutch people voted against it. Now the Dutch ministers are saying, well, actually, we're still going to go ahead with it. Well, we'd like to see how well, as Lisa said today, we'd like to see how the Dutch people react to that. I don't think they're going to be too happy. So watch that. The big one for me was Austria. I mean, Austria, the chief of Austrian General Staff met the counterpart in Moscow and said Australian armed forces want to cooperate with Moscow, as Russia is much more closely aligned to Austria than other major powers. And and he stated that one of the reasons for his visit to the Russian capital was to disobey others' orders. And he said, I'm not going to carry out instructions and follow orders on who's worth talking to and who's not. That's exactly the reason why I decided to pay you a visit. So what does that, to me, tells you? It's the death of NATO. Austria's going, a small nation, economically, don't often hear them saying much globally, but they've basically said, we've had enough of this, and if we want to go and talk to the Russians and form military ties, or whatever ties we want to, we're going to do so, and it's none of your business anymore, NATO, or whoever else is dictating to us. And around the same time, Putin met the president of Austria, Heinz Fischer, and during that talks, it planned to discuss a whole range of Russian-Austrian cooperation in trade, economy, and other aspects. And this was on the back of an official visit that Putin made to Austria. They were going to obviously implement those agreements. What were those agreements about? It was about Ukraine. It was about sanctions and the South Stream gas pipeline. So I think that's a huge indication when people say nothing's happening. Well, we know Germany's turning its back. Well, so's Austria in a huge way. And the fact they've publicly gone out there and said, you know what, we don't really care what you say anymore. We want to go and talk to Russia and form ties with them, economic and militarily, we'll do so. So watch out for more and more developments like that throughout Europe. I mean, France, we had all the demonstrations. Switzerland's tied up some deals with China. And obviously the whole Greece thing rumbles on with the whole IMF disclosure about the IMF trying to take Greece down and the IMF denying it, and the list goes on. And Germany continues to make all the right noises that it wants to join forces with Russia, and it's had enough of German internal policy on immigration. It's had enough of all the sanctions. So we need to pay attention to all the increasing developments across Europe, and I think that's probably a good significant point worth making. In terms of the site, well, obviously we have the Facebook page, the Serious Report. We've got, I think, nearly 1,250 members all there, so it's growing quite quickly, and you're welcome to join. If you want to, contribute, please contribute. We do restrict posts, but that's just to make sure, because we do sometimes get the odd person who joins us, who then tries to post things that not very appropriate, and that's putting it diplomatically, and I think you can guess what they're trying to post. And so we don't tend to want to restrict posts if people put stuff on, provided it's in the geopolitical and economic angle. People can post, you can contribute. If you want to ask questions, please ask questions. If we don't know the answers, we'll be honest and say we don't know the answers, and if we can find out, we'll subsequently go away and have a look at it. We have got a blog which is a bit underused. I have been way too busy with other things lately, but obviously that's also the series report .weebly at weebly.com. We do have a Twitter page which is, well, it's completely underutilised as well. That's at the Serious Report. Obviously we've got the podcast. Andy puts them up regularly. They're all available on the site. If anyone wants to, listen to the old shows, take a listen. If you've got any questions, you can contact us through the blog as well. There's a contact page, so you can send us an email. And the basis is we try to present the facts, what's going on, support it with evidence. I have obviously exposure to the industry and financial sector and know what's going on. It's not just things I'm told. Part of my interest and things I've done is to examine what's going on geopolitically and understand things. And I'm part of a wider group where we share ideas and we discuss things and try to come to some understanding, and we feed that information back to interested parties, which actually has been not only quite interesting from our perspective, but has actually been quite interesting where that information has ultimately ended up. So that group's it's not a public group, and we don't discuss who we are and talk about the things we talk about because we can't do so. And sometimes we've widely speculated on things that have turned out to be nonsense too, so we equally make some mistakes. So it's best to make the mistakes internally rather than regurgitating it on the radio and looking like idiots, which we would do if we said those things. And I guess that's basically it.
That's it. Well, thank you very much for joining us again, Paul. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And
no, likewise, and always a pleasure to talk to both of you too.
And we'll get something organised and get you back on again soon. Thank you
very much, Paul.
No, thanks very much, and as ever, thanks, because Andy, you started all this. You tried to persuade me for a long time to do it, and then Lisa one day said, "Come on, do it," and we kind of got together, and it's been a real pleasure to do it ever since. And so thank you, because without you, I don't think we would have ever started. So, and Lisa, of course, who gave me all the encouragement to start doing it. So thank you very much.
Oh, you've got me blushing now, Paul. I'd just like to say to everyone, we've got a special treat for you tonight. We've just been the warm-up act, really. The main event's coming, Dr. Rock. So stay tuned. We'll play out with a little short burst of music, and the doc will be with you. And tonight it's Call the Doctor.
Tune into the Dr. Rock Show, Thursdays at 8 p.m. on raconteursnews.com. Hey Doc, you rock.